In this roundup of the week, European governments are terrified of what seems to be an emerging second wave of COVID-19. Americans fight partisan wars over masks and hydroxychloroquine, and the tech companies take another step in the censorship of bad thoughts. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the rudely interrupted question that is 2020. I hope you're well and dodging the virus. And it seems that dodging the virus is believed to be a harder task than it actually is, at least as far as the general public's concerned. A new poll was released this week which surveys citizens from the UK, the US, Sweden, Germany and Japan to find out what percentage of the population they believed had died as a result of COVID-19. And the results are pretty breathtaking. US citizens believe that around 9% of people had died due to COVID-19. 9%! So for every 10 people you know, you'd be thinking that nearly one should have died. Had that been the case, the death rate in the US would have been approaching nearly 30 million. The total number of deaths in the world is currently listed at only 670,000. I mean, we all know the data's junk with different countries measuring different things. I'm pretty sure we'd have noticed if it was that far out. Germany, which has so far done the best in keeping the numbers of fatalities down, actually did the worst in the mismatch between reality and perception. Its citizens thought that 3% of people had died, which was 300 times higher than the reality of what had happened in Germany. Woohoo for the UK! Along with Japan and Sweden, we only came up with a figure that was 100 times too high. Oh, except for Scotland. If you split Scotland out, they apparently believe that over 10% of people had died, which is even higher. Obviously, those perceptions matter. If you're trying to open up your country again, how people perceive the degree of risk that's involved can make a huge difference in what they do and how they behave. And none of this has been helped by the tenor of public debate, certainly in the UK and also in the US. In the UK, Boris Johnson's game of whack-a-mole, in other words, doing local lockdowns where there's a rise in numbers in a particular area, is generally testing the patience of those who get hit. Because the geographical spread of the restrictions are rather broad, you can suddenly find yourself under renewed restrictions because of something that's happening some way away from where you actually live. And unsurprisingly, people are not thrilled to find themselves at the sharp end of that sort of apparently arbitrary rule. People are also not thrilled that today the Prime Minister postponed planned relaxations that were to come into effect over this weekend. People who were primed to celebrate their weddings, with receptions of up to 30 people, for instance, who suddenly have an upsetting and probably fairly costly adjustment to make. And indeed to all Muslims who were planning to celebrate Eid tomorrow likewise. And then the same holds true for the UK's travel restrictions on other countries. So last week we had a quarantine introduced for travel from Spain, which has seen a resurgence in cases. But at the start of this week, the argument was being made, look, it's only certain parts of Spain that are seeing cases, other parts not at all. The Canary Islands, self-contained, generally very low level. But the answer came back, no, blanket requirement. And then this week, Luxembourg was added. Belgium seems likely to follow because of the resurgence that's starting to happen there. And this is happening because the UK government seems now to be terrified of the idea that there's a second wave poised to sweep across Europe. They have been hammered so hard and so consistently by the critics saying they should have locked down sooner. And if they'd locked down sooner, then thousands fewer would have died. You could be forgiven for wanting to ensure that you wouldn't be culpable for what happens next. It's understandable, but the problem, as ever, is what we don't know. Those people telling them they should have locked down sooner, we don't really have evidence that they're right. It's just an assumption on their part. We're seeing the first signs of the damage that's being done through the lockdown itself, but it hasn't hit hard yet. We don't ultimately know which course of action is going to create the least harm to the most people. But we're strapped onto the boat and we're going wherever it's going. Are they right that we're going to see a second wave, as so many are fearing? So far it's not clear, because minor upticks can be a sign of relaxing lockdowns without them necessarily surging into major spikes again. In the past, I've made the observation that upticks have generally not happened in areas that were hit hard the first time round. The US states currently seeing lots of cases were the ones that weren't being hit at the time when New York was being hit, for instance. And New York and London and Stockholm, these are not currently seeing upticks. But the big challenge to that perspective is what's happening in Spain. Because if my theory was right, then we wouldn't see any major upticks in Spain or Italy or Belgium for that matter. We might see them in countries that were held to do better, such as Germany and the Scandinavian countries except for Sweden. One thing that's worth noting is if you break down the regional impact on Spain, then there's some support for the theory, but it's not clear. So this is how the different parts of Europe were hit. You can see that Spain was hit hard in the north, although less so in certain parts of the northeast, principally Aragon. And if you look at the map of what's worst hit now, Aragon is the primary hotspot. But it's not a perfectly convenient picture. There's some increase in and around Madrid, for instance, that was certainly hit hard the first time around. According to Salvador Illa, the Spanish health minister, the outbreaks have been connected to family gatherings, parties and nightlife and the movement of temporary workers. The puzzle is why it's happening in Spain and not in Italy, which was similarly one of the worst hit at the same time as Spain, but where there's no signs of any resurgence at all so far. And the cultures of the countries are broadly the same. You'd expect them to have come out of lockdown in more or less the same way. In the US, there's at least good news in that the states that have seen the recent surge in cases seem to have plateaued. Deaths continue to increase, of course, because of the time lag between catching the virus and dying, but it gives some hope that we will see a real decline soon. And if the end of the spread of the pandemic is in sight, that would be fantastic news. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight of the spread of utter stupidity. And arguably, it seems unlikely there will be until, I'm guessing November? If you reach the point where discussions about medications and measures such as mask wearing have become politicised, then you have collectively lost your minds. But that's where we are. And one of the big symbolic areas is, whisper it quietly, the mask debate. Actually, no, don't whisper it quietly. People might mishear what you're saying and get totally the wrong idea.
The mask debate was taken to a whole nother level.
Bishop David Zubik tells Pittsburgh's Action News 4 he found himself in the middle of a mask debate.
And we'll dive deeper into this pet store mask debate.
So we're going to begin with this thing we're calling the Great Mask Debate.
The mask debate. Now, this isn't an exclusively American bit of nonsense. There are some right mask debaters in the UK and elsewhere, but America is where it has achieved the pinnacle. Now, the first question, if someone dies of COVID-19, is, was he a mask wearer or a mask denier? For something that was considered only months ago to be something that might help a bit, so long as you didn't mess about with it too much, it's now become the article of faith. I had someone in the comments section today responding to last week's video saying it couldn't have been the protests that initially fueled the sudden spike because the protesters were wearing masks. It must have been those people in the churches, because those are the bad people. Because not only are they on the other side, they usually don't wear masks. Now look, I appreciate why people on different sides of the political divide would find it really convenient if this would become a neat and tidy point of moral difference. But the point is, the virus doesn't care, and neither do I. Masks made a bit of difference, being outside makes a bit of difference, but if you all gather together in large numbers and shout and stuff, then the difference is minimised. Likewise, yes, congregating in indoor venues is also going to spread the virus. The point is, you don't get to do the dumb thing, and then say that your dumb thing wasn't dumb, but the other guy's dumb thing was uber dumb. This week, the focus moved to Herman Cain, the former Republican presidential candidate and Trump supporter, who sadly died this week. And the headlines were, Herman Cain, who refused to wear a mask, dies after COVID-19 diagnosis. And another one, Herman Cain, the 74, dies of COVID-19 after going to Trump's notorious Tulsa rally without a mask. Never mind who he was, who cared about him and what he'd achieved in his life, which was plenty. It was all about the mask wearing. Don't get me wrong, I think wearing a mask is something you should probably do on all the evidence, and if your government says you should, it's not a big infringement of your human rights, really, to do it. There are bigger issues to make a stand on. But let's be clear, people are only taking these sorts of stands because they don't believe it makes that much of a difference, not because they don't care if people catch the virus. It wasn't that long ago that Dr. Fauci was telling people that masks weren't important. And when you change messages halfway through, you lose people who probably believed you the first time and now don't know what to believe. But it's become such a point of focus. People are now getting violent over it, with people attacking people who refuse to wear a mask and people attacking people like shop staff or bus drivers who ask them to wear a mask. And then you see things like this week. At least 8 county sheriffs in Texas have said that they won't enforce the local mask mandate because it violates people's civil rights. The whole thing has been trivial and bonkers for some time, and I've tended to ignore it, but it has arguably become a defining political issue pre-election. It's the plastic bag of coronavirus. In the environmental discussions, people ended up debating passionately about plastic bags and plastic straws. And it's because it's something that's immediate, right in front of your nose, that made it real, even if it was trivial compared to the bigger issues and what really needed to be done. And that's the mask debate for coronavirus. Then, of course, there's the drug debate. A video went viral earlier this week that showed a group calling themselves America's Frontline Doctors, talking about how hydroxychloroquine used with zinc and azithromycin was not just an effective drug in reducing harm or alleviating symptoms, but it was an out-and-out cure. Nobody has to die, said one of the speakers. We have a cure. In a normal, sane universe, you would hear that and recognise immediately that absolute certainty of a cure in the absence of solid scientific confirmation is a tell for snake oil. I mean, whether it turns out hydroxychloroquine has a beneficial effect or not, there's no data that should lead an actual medical professional to think that they could stand up and make that specific statement with no qualification, no ifs, no buts. But this is not a normal, sane universe. So you had Donald Trump Jr. and the president himself retweeting the video. And then, of course, once that's happened, the whole universe descends on the thing. Twitter took it down and suspended Trump Jr. for tweeting it. YouTube took it down. Squarespace took down the America's Frontline Doctors website. By the time they did that, millions of people had seen the video, of course, and no doubt millions more have done since, because there's always a way. And people get into the detail of, well, there was this one study that said it might be effective, but then there was this other study that said it wasn't effective, so we need more. Honestly, there are times when you've got to stop looking only at what's in front of your nose. Step back and see the bigger picture. The 2 reasons why people are debating whether or not a drug might or might not be effective is because the president, a man with no medical training nor with any specific advice on the subject, said that he personally thinks it might be. The second reason is that the media and the Democrats and everyone else, because Trump had said that, now will do anything to show it's of no use whatsoever. They would be distraught if it turned out to be effective. And they would, by all appearances, dismiss evidence that said it was as some sort of Trump trick. Do you know where else this discussion is going on in the world? Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Everywhere else, they know that medical doctors and companies are working and coming up with drug treatments and vaccines. They follow it with interest, the progress that's being made. They celebrate the breakthroughs as they get reported. And they're keen to know that they will get timely access when the big breakthroughs are concerned. Of course, that's rest of the world normal. Let's be clear. That's not rest of the world not understanding beautiful American virtues. That's rest of the world not losing their collective mind over ridiculous nonsense. If Trump had said it, and then everyone had just said, well, we should definitely look at the results of trials into that because any possible way forward is going to be good, it had gone away. Really, probably quite quickly. But instead, people jumped up and down, made it into a political point of pride, but it must be proven to be nonsense. And it probably is nonsense. Statistically, the chance that a drug that a public figure happens to lurch onto profiling turns out to be the best one, pretty slim. and the chance that it's a cure and early testing wouldn't have been more optimistic than the early testing has been, pretty slim. But if it turned out not to be nonsensical, we now have an institutional barrage of people to shoot it down, deny any value it might have, which is also not helpful. It's the way the debate has been conducted that is dumb, more than the proposition itself. Both sides can blame each other for that, but it comes down to how they're bouncing off each other. We also have to grapple with that question about the social media companies striking down the video. Was this justified action? Removing something that might actively lead people to do something that would be harmful to themselves? Or was it a violation of free speech? Because immediate and high-profile scorn for the message and the credibility of the messengers would have been plenty. It's definitely living in a grey area, because if some people specifically encourage people to independently, without medical supervision, take a drug that would be harmful, then you'd have to say that it was fair enough to take that down. If on the other hand you don't do that, but you say something like, in my experience, this is the answer to our problem, well then I don't see that the social media companies should be the arbiters of whether that's accurate or not. After all, the official line has changed a number of times. There's a line to be drawn, but is it the tech companies that should be drawing it? If your position is that you're going to take down anything that's critical of the official line, you might as well call Xi Jinping and tell him that America has seen the error of its ways. Unfortunately, the tech companies seem to be extending their reach when it comes to interfering in wrong stuff. So I do recognise it's a grey area, and I'm not blaming anyone, but I would have left it alone. There were lots of people queuing up to point out its flaws. Openly taking down an arguably harmful message is one thing, but some of it seems to be more routine and more connected with your viewpoint. Breitbart, the right-wing news site, said that Google had basically choked all of its traffic incrementally over several updates, but now more or less completely. And it showed the graph of its traffic coming from Google to prove it. Now, you might think Breitbart is an awful junk site, but you're perfectly happy if it struggles to get viewers. Are you really happy having Google make that decision for you? Remember, don't endorse a practice you wouldn't want used against you if the other side took control and decided to follow the same precedent. Apparently on Tuesday this week, the site disappeared from Google entirely, along with a number of other sites, mostly, but not exclusively, conservative sites. Breitbart, the National Pulse, the Drudge Report, Newsbusters, the Bongino Report, and Human Events. And at least one left-leaning website, Occupy Democrats, was also affected. A former Google engineer, Mike Wacker, said that the glitch seemed to suggest the existence of some kind of blacklist. Now, it may be that this was still happening when I followed up on the original Breitbart story, because I copied and pasted a headline from one of the news stories on the site into Google, and Breitbart was not in the results. To use the exact wording of a heading, you would normally expect to find it as number 1. Now, when I tried the same thing again today, it did work. So it may well have been a symptom of the glitch that they mentioned from earlier this week. These sorts of questions were centre stage on Wednesday this week, when the chief executives of Google, Facebook, Amazon and Apple were called to testify to the House Judiciary Antitrust Committee. Unfortunately, politicians involved in such committee hearings are often not the best informed that you might hope for. So you had Representative Greg Stube asking the chief executive of Google why some of his emails were going to the spam, rather than giving him statistics like those that Breitbart had shared. Well, of course, everybody has emails going to spam, so it was completely the wrong target. Nevertheless, less than 100 days before the election, everyone is pretty sensitive about factors that may swing even the tiniest bit of support. And the social media companies are going to find themselves under an unenviable amount of pressure. Because we've never seen two sides so determined to control the narrative. As season 1 of the Trump presidency comes towards its exciting finale, we've gone to that point where all the intrigue and the subplots give way as everything starts to fall apart as we're gearing up for the big battle in the last episode. One sign of this is the constant fighting and rioting that's going on. Except is it? Some people say that Antifa doesn't exist and it's all fake news. Others say that it's all peaceful. Well, mostly peaceful. This week, ABC News raised a few eyebrows with a tweet that said, protesters in California set fire to a courthouse, damaged a police station and assaulted officers after a peaceful demonstration intensified. Ah yes, intense peace breaks out. Many casualties. Of course, it's all just part of the polarised nonsense. One side highlights the violence and focuses only on that, which to be fair is fairly normal. When there is violence, generally violent riots are bad campaign strategy because whatever message the peaceful protesters are trying to get over tends to get completely submerged by the acts of violence if they happen. Which of course was what the researcher David Shaw pointed out when he tweeted a research paper indicating as much, and yeah, he got fired. But yes, one side is focusing on the violence because they want to project the president as strong on law and order to maximise his chances of getting re-elected. The other side is supporting the protests, even in the case of some of the governors and mayors when they are burning their city, which is just weird. And so you can only talk about how the protests are mostly peaceful, just like the Seattle Autonomous Zone, CHOP, was mostly peaceful, if you didn't count the dead people. All of this is lunacy. And you can't see that there is any way things get to calm down until the election is done. You have President Trump pushing out messages that the election is going to be the biggest fraud in history with mail-in ballots. And of course people focused on him saying that maybe they should postpone the election because they're always looking for their Hitler scare stories. But of course he doesn't have the power to put back the election. And nobody else has any intention to put back the election. It's just distracting nonsense. But the messages about election fraud, those are the ones that will persist and do the real damage. On the other side, you've got demonstrators peacefully blinding cops with laser beams and throwing fireworks, and one of the two main political parties basically supporting them. And we're, going to have an election where we discuss policies in a genteel way and what would be good for the country while the fabric of the place is falling apart? You have two sides who both genuinely believe that the country will end if the other person wins the election. They're both wrong, except sometimes a thing becomes true simply because enough people believe it to be true, and that's the danger. There is a choice here. You don't have to immerse yourself in the madness. For one thing, you don't have to accept the partisan mindset that's being offered to you. And secondly, because however bad things get, life will go on. People will have to rebuild trust and common purpose. You might as well decide you're going to do what you can to be one of those people. Fewer of the issues you care about hinge on who wins the election than you think. And I know people won't believe that. But the policy you think you support rarely gets executed well, and the one that you most fear rarely gets executed well, and the real world has a habit of eventually pushing politicians to do things they didn't originally intend to do, that they have to do, especially when they're not looking towards re-election, which neither candidate would be doing if you believe Joe Biden's word. Anyway, enough of that, just time for one thing that I dislike and one thing that I like. The thing that I dislike, I thought the hearings with the tech company CEOs were reasonably good. People asked pointed questions and listened to the answers. That was in no way the same experience of what happened to the Attorney General William Barr. Hearings where Democratic politicians made speeches, threw accusations and insults, and then interrupted whenever he actually started to answer a question. If you want to hold someone to account, asking them smart questions, letting them answer, then pursuing with even smarter follow-up questions, that's how you do it. Grandstanding, talking over your witness just made everyone look like idiots, except probably for him. But even Barr had it better than Michael Shellenberger had it. Shellenberger, whose recent article I discussed in a separate video, was called upon to testify to the Congressional Energy Committee. It didn't go well. And not because he failed to represent himself well or got caught out saying something wrong. Basically, they had two Democrats, Kasten and Huffman, use all of their time absolutely slating him, calling him a denier, which of course he isn't, quoting the climate feedback article saying it completely debunked him, which it doesn't. And then the chair of the session simply point blank refused to let him respond to any of the allegations, which is disgraceful behaviour.
I believe that Mr. Huffman, Mr. Kasten, and Mr. Levin all effectively accused us of not telling the truth. Further, he dragged one of the witnesses through the mud I would
And
just
what
like
is
to
your
ask you,
parliamentary inquiry?
would it be appropriate to ask unanimous consent for the witness that got dragged through the mud to be able to respond to the allegations that were made against him?
He can do that on his book tour.
He is free. He is free to do that in the public square of ideas. So thank you all very much. We are adjourned.
That's entirely inappropriate.
People were clearly not there to hear anything that wasn't exactly what they wanted to hear. Quite remarkable. Schellenberger wrote a piece for Quillette talking about the incident, which is linked in the video description below. And then one thing that I like. This will be a surprise to one of my regular viewers, but I'm amazed at how talented some of the people I meet on here actually are. Whatever your taste in music is, you should nevertheless be in awe. I mean, in awe of this woman's vocals. She has an album out now, and I think it's very cool. She'll probably be horrified because having an old git like me like your music is probably the kiss of death. But anyway, here is a brief clip of Destroyer Mariko.
This fire burns always. This is the broken ground. Misery begins to rise. Turn away from yesterday. Tomorrow's in my eyes. Oh, never more to be held down by the wings of history.
Brilliant stuff. I've linked to that video below. Check out her album, and if you really like what you hear, she has a Patreon as well, which could do with some love. And speaking of Patreon, thanks to all of those who support this channel on Patreon, which helps me to continue making videos on a range of topics, some of which YouTube advertisers don't want to go anywhere near. It's weird because it's completely unpredictable. I did a video on transgender athletes this week. Was sure that was going to get taken out, and it wasn't. This one, who knows? So, thanks in particular to those that signed up in the last week. Chip, Shay, Des, Adina and Alex. If you want to join them in supporting the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to provide on this channel, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.